Let me know if that's coming through.
Yeah, we can see it.
All right. Well, thanks for giving me an opportunity to present this paper. This paper I wrote last fall. The topic is a particular question that comes up when people contemplate and debate sort of philosophical implications of mind uploading. One big question that comes up is this issue of your stream of consciousness and how important it is to sort of take certain interpretations of it when you're contemplating how mind uploading sort of affects your identity under certain sorts of procedures. Before I launch, I might say this again at the end. Converting a paper into a terse slide deck is both it's both fun and also frustrating, because it's fun to try to boil your ideas down to concise slides, but it's frustrating because you cannot pack 10 pages of thorough exploration into a presentation. So I always invite any watchers or listeners to a presentation of a paper to please take the time to read the paper after the fact. Hopefully the slides and the presentation are merely sort of a tantalizing invitation to do that. All right, let's see what we got here. So new slides are still coming through, is that right?
That is right.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so one of the most popular methods of mind uploading, where we would somehow sort of rid ourselves of our biological brain and sort of continue the neural processing and the psychological experience of ourselves in a futuristic quasi-computer of some sort. One of the most common ways of conceiving of doing this is generally called scan and copy, where by some means you actually scan the structural information of the brain, and from that scan you basically do a lot of computer processing on those scans to build a neurological functional model of how the brain actually propagates signals around within it to produce all of the behavior that the brain does. And once you have that model, you can then emulate or instantiate that model in some new system, again, sort of ostensibly some kind of computer. By the time we have the technology to do this, it won't resemble anything like what we use the word computer to describe in our current era, but we all sort of know conceptually what we're kind of thinking about, some kind of advanced neuro sort of emulating computer. One reason that this comes up a lot, the scan and copy procedure, is that it is actually one of the least speculative. It's one of the most likely ways to actually upload our minds into a computer system. Physically slicing a brain up is something that we already do. Physically sort of studying that scan data and trying to produce computer models of the scans to produce these functional networks in the computer that emulate the networks of the brain is something that we do, sort of in a cursory early 21st century kind of desperate early stages way. This is by far the most technically feasible. When people explore other ways, Hans Moravec presented a way in the 80s in which you sort of slowly vaporize your entire head from the top down and sort of gather all the scan data as you go. But that requires some phenomenal nanotechnology that's never been conceived of. Later in this paper, I will describe and discuss the alternative philosophical topic that comes up the most often, called gradual in-place replacement, where you sort of infuse the brain with tens of billions of tiny little prosthetic nanobots that emulate neurons and replace them. This is a very popular topic in sort of philosophical discussions, but as to whether anything like that could ever be done in practicality, to be honest, I tend to take a fairly conservative view of these topics for fear of being kind of viewed as an unearthed futurist. But scan and copy is actually likely to happen someday, which means we really do need to sort of make our mind up about what we think is happening philosophically. But Nevertheless, despite the fact that scan and copy is probably feasible, there's a major concern that it doesn't do what we're hoping it'll do. People say that if you scan the brain in total and then instantiate it in a second system, that you have not, quote, quote, transferred your mind over to the computer. Instead, the true you, the one original you, died when the brain was, essentially destroyed by slices up. And that when you recreate the system and reawaken it, and all of the neural functions are replicated, and all the psychological experiences are replicated, and all the sense of self reemerges, what you really get is a new invoked identity, and that the person has not survived the procedure. And by most descriptions of the goal of mind uploading, this would not be considered a successful procedure. People might see it as a secondary priority of, let me create a copy of myself because it's better than nothing. But we all understand that, really the goal of mind uploading is to preserve your sense of your identity. So there is this concern that because your stream of consciousness clearly ends when you slice a brain up and destroy it so that you can scan it, that the new stream of consciousness that is restarted in the rebooted system is actually a new metaphysical person. That is the concern, and that is the entire topic of this paper and of this presentation. So, of course, we can't really debate what happens to the stream of consciousness if we don't kind of figure out what we mean by the stream of consciousness. The most immediate and obvious description of a stream of consciousness is your stream of conscious thoughts, your stream of waking conscious thoughts. The moment-to-moment experience you're having right now at this very moment is your stream of consciousness. And this, of course, immediately runs right up against everyday scenarios in which that doesn't happen. Your stream of consciousness undergoes all sorts of diminutions, such as sleeping, fainting, general anesthesia. The immediate question is, well, when you undergo that sort of a break in your stream of consciousness, do you die, and then does a new person emerge, sort of every morning when you wake up? If that were the correct interpretation, then of the stream of consciousness, then that's why scan and copy doesn't preserve you either. But of course, that is not how we think of ourselves every day when we wake up. So clearly, this is not really what we mean by stream of consciousness. It would be a red herring for me to actually attack this definition in this paper. It really would be sort of disingenuous on my part. But it's worth sort of creeping up on what we're really trying to talk about here, because this is where it all starts. And the obvious interpretation is just your stream of thoughts moment to moment. So one solution is to come up with some sort of philosophical bridging criterion. This is sort of a term that comes up in philosophy of identity, that basically says, well, the stream of consciousness itself undergoes these diminutions during sleep, but there's some sort of metaphysical bridge that allows the identity to jump over that gap, so that the stream of consciousness admittedly actually does go down, but the identity does not go away. Alternatively, we can just try to find a completely different definition. Maybe the stream of consciousness isn't your awareness while you're awake. Maybe it's something else. So a common proposal when sort of having a debate of this sort about mind uploading is that what we really mean by stream of consciousness is not just the moment-to-moment waking business. It is really this concept that your brain never stops running, never stops functioning neurologically. And because the brain is, and this is true of sleep, well, first of all, we all know it's true of sleep because we know that when we're dreaming, there's a lot going on. But of course, with modern brain scanning equipment, we can see the activity in a brain in a variety of states of consciousness of various medical patients. And we know for a fact that the brain is frothing with activity, not only when you're asleep, but when you pass out and faint. It's not like your brain just turns off. That's not at all true. When you are in the operating room under general anesthesia, it is not true that your brain just turns off. That's not what happens. There's plenty of neurological activity, even though your state of consciousness is radically altered. So the claim is that because the brain is still performing neurological work, there are mental effects going on, even though they are not at the level of our waking awareness. And it is all of this sort of underlying subconscious psychology that is carrying our metaphysical identity along. So the stream of consciousness relevant to our identity is sort of maintained throughout all these procedures by this underlying basal neural activity. But the argument is that if you ever did break that level of consciousness, that really low level neural activity, such as if you sliced up a cadaver's brain and scanned it, that is a brain that is not experiencing any dynamic metabolism, much less sort of neural activity at all. So if you were to break that level of activity and consciousness, then that really does destroy an identity. And even if you recreate those functional properties and psychological properties later, what you get is a new identity. That's the claim. That's the proposal that we're trying to take seriously here.
Can I quickly ask, I didn't know from the start of the talk whether you meant to just go through and have us ask all questions afterward, or if you wanted us to interrupt. Which do you prefer?
It is hard to loop back to a slide 20 slides earlier. And it's also hard as a viewer to sort of try to hold your tongue. I don't mind if people want to step in. I'm not entirely sure how our format works. I suspect most of the viewers on YouTube just don't have the option of doing
but
that.
they know that they can.
Yeah. If there's any audio means by which to trip in, if someone watching the YouTube stream wants to sort of let me know that there are questions appearing, I'm happy to take them on the fly. It's fine.
Okay.
Did you have one?
I have one. Yes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
You mentioned that during anesthesia, it's not as if the brain is entirely inactive, but would it be accurate to say that the activity that the brain still exhibits is not the same as the activity during waking? So perhaps some regions of the brain are less active than they normally would be.
Well, surely. And of course, you know more about this than I do. But I don't think that the point of these debates is whether a certain kind of brain activity is, I don't think anyone's claiming that the brain is operating the same way in all these states. They're just claiming that the critical way relevant to maintaining your stream of consciousness is somehow unaffected throughout all these procedures. I think that's what they're getting at. The thing that's relevant to your identity is essentially the same throughout all of these procedures.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah. No. It's definitely I'm definitely not claiming that the brain works the same way in all these states. Certainly not.
I have a more question.
Yep.
Hi. So, I mean, I think you kind of referenced it or alluded to it earlier. You were talking about medical conditions, and I think you might have been talking about like disorders of consciousness. So people in like comas or minimally conscious states or vegetative states, and how they've also been measured as far as fMRIs. And I was wondering if you are going to talk about that, or if you could speak very quickly about how you perceive consciousness in people with comas or vegetative states or minimally conscious states.
I don't talk too much about the specific ways in which the brain operates. I didn't sort of do the research to understand exactly what general anesthesia means. But later in the talk, we do talk about how far down you can go in, quote, turning the brain off before it really means something substantial. We'll get to that. Okay. So another thing about debates of this sort is that they're all taking place amongst people who find mind uploading interesting in the first place, which of course is probably a fairly small segment of the population. And therefore, the people who have a serious concern about scan and copy mind uploading aren't against the whole concept in principle. In fact, they often have in mind a notion of a procedure that they believe would work. They believe that it is actually possible to upload your mind. It just has to be done the way they prefer. A very common thought experiment that comes up is, I call it gradual in-place replacement. I'm not sure if that's the universal term, but of course it's immediately comprehensible. And in this experiment, what you do is there's about 86 billion relevant neurons in the brain. So you insert 86 billion futuristic cell scale, cellular scale prosthetic neurons. Colloquially, they're called nanobots. They're not actually as small as the nanoscale, but perhaps they're composed of elements that are nanoscale. So that's sort of where the term comes from. Every one of these things travels throughout your brain to an assigned host neuron. It sits next to the neuron. It models the neuron. It learns the neuron's function. And slowly over time, as you can see across the sort of pictorial depiction, the idea is that gradually, not all at once, these artificial prosthetics take over the function of the biological neuron that they've been assigned to. And eventually the biological neuron is sort of disconnected from all its dendritic and axonal connections and the little computers doing all the work. And eventually you get to a point where all the neurons have been physically, essentially replaced. And the brain has been replaced within your own head by a computer. So stream of consciousness proponents, as I sort of call them in the paper, the people who insist that the stream of consciousness is important and that scan and copy doesn't preserve it. They like gradual and place replacement. They believe that it will preserve your identity and it will represent a survival by the person. So I'll come back to the stream of consciousness business in a minute. Let's look at another reason why people often find gradual and place replacement more comfortable. It is often asked, I don't mean to pick on too many people by individual name, but one person who has sort of the credentials of being a professor who says this a lot is Susan Schneider. Sometimes people ask in a discontinuous, meaning sort of scan it all once, make a model on the computer, and then reinstantiate it or emulate it later all at once. In a discontinuous scan and copy procedure, how in the world does your identity get out of your head and move over to the computer? It's asked in very literal terms. How does your identity know that it's supposed to go to the other side of the room, that it belongs over there now? How does anybody figure that out? How does your identity figure that out? This question is asked, it's asked not facetiously, it's asked very seriously. And what this question is really doing is treating your identity, this incredibly abstract and philosophical concept, as if it has some very physical traits, such as coordinates in space and properties of movement. Basically, they're asking, how does your identity fly over through the room to the computer to take up home in a new home? And again, I'm not trying to sound facetious. I'm putting a very literal interpretation on the argument because I really don't understand how else to interpret it. And of course, the defense of gradual and place replacement is that there is no spatial transfer. It all happens inside your head. Nothing has to go anywhere, including even abstract non-physical concepts like identity. It all just stays in the head the whole time. And it is that avoidance of the spatial transfer issue that makes gradual and place replacement an identity preserving process. So a point that I like to make is that it is simply incorrect that gradual in-place replacement does not involve transferring sort of non-physical traits. When one of these sort of futuristic proposed nanobots sits next to a neuron to study it, it can't be in literally the same physical location as the neuron. It can be next to it. It could even be touching it, which I'm not necessarily showing in this picture. I mean, they could actually be rubbing cell walls with one another, but they're not in the same location. And when the neuron's functional work is moved over to the nanobot, or when the nanobot takes ownership of that role, find your preferred terminology. This non-physical thing, this functional work, moves over to the nanobot. It's a spatial transfer of non-physical properties. And given the scale of neurons, it ranges from tens to hundreds of microns, which is not small by any means. And to be honest, this really is just the same issue all over again. Instead of asking how identity flies through the room, we're asking, how does this functional work move over to the nanobot? It really is the same question.
Would it be fair, though, to critique this by saying that perhaps you're not talking about the same question because you're now claiming you've just drawn the same bird there. So it looks like you're claiming that when you move the function of one neuron to another neuron, that identity, that whole complex thing is flying over from that one neuron to that other neuron. Whereas what you could really only say is that a teeny tiny component of what makes up what generates your sense of identity is actually flying over from that neuron to the other neuron in this case, right? Whereas both those neurons are integrated with the functioning of the entire system that's producing personal identity.
Yes, only the one neuron's little sort of 86 billionth proportion of your identity moves over. But why is it a valid question how your whole identity flies over, but not a valid question, however, how a small fraction of your identity flies over? We're still talking about a non-physical thing, neural work, or the non-physical sort of psychological traits that come from neural work, and we're asking how that moves through space to some other location. And I just don't think that the concept makes sense. Now, one counter argument here is, well, okay, but I mean, we're talking about the scale of cells. I mean, I'm not really being fair, because really the question was how you move across the room. And it's really amazing. I ran the math on this, and it turns out that gradual in-place replacement, which is a very highly favored procedure, often because people believe it has no spatial transfer involved, accumulates hundreds of kilometers of transfer when you add up 86 billion neurons worth of a couple of microns each of this transfer. Now, this doesn't mean that gradual in-place replacement isn't a better procedure for some other philosophical reason, which I'll get to in a minute. It means that this argument that there's no spatial transfer involved is just, well, I think it's just not correct, essentially, for the reasons that I've described. I think that there is a spatial transfer of non-physical processes, and we just have to figure out how we're going to come to terms with that. So favoring gradual in-place replacement specifically on the spatial transfer argument doesn't make sense. But there are other reasons why we might like a continuous procedure, a gradual procedure, as opposed to a discontinuous, sudden sort of, slice and scan procedure. One of the most common arguments in favor of gradual in-place replacement is that it is done the piecemeal style. And that's often described as running even while you're awake. So it's actually happening while the brain is operating. This is, of course, an appeal to the famous Ship of Theseus thought experiment. But why is piecemeal replacement important? I mean, it can't just be important because we say so. There's got to be a justification. Well, apparently the preservation of continuous neural function throughout the process is the reason. Okay, but why is continuous neural function important? Like, why is that what we need from our mind uploading process? Well, it's because it's continuous neural function that enables a continuous stream of consciousness. And again, it doesn't have to be a waking stream of consciousness. It can just be this some sort of constant stream of neural activity throughout the entire process that sort of keeps your identity humming along from the beginning to the end of the procedure. So that's the line of reasoning that sort of gets us to where we are now, where there is this concern that the stream of consciousness needs to be maintained throughout the procedure. So is the stream of consciousness important? That's what we need to figure out next. So of course the question is, how do we know our identity is consistent across various kinds of procedures? I've already mentioned some of the simpler examples: falling asleep, fainting, even general anesthesia. This is again, like I said, the bridge problem. How does your identity bridge across gaps in our sort of apparent sort of basic concepts of stream of consciousness? And as I've alluded to, usually when people contemplate these scenarios, the response is, well, because the brain keeps working a little bit. On some low level, the neurons are still processing signals, and therefore you've got this sort of concept of psychology. It's a very subconscious psychology, but there's some sort of aspect of mental states being preserved, and your stream of consciousness rides along on those mental states. So the argument is that in none of those scenarios does the last tendril of neural activity cease. Therefore, the mental activity continues, even if subconscious, and so does this stream of consciousness. And therefore, because everything is this sort of unbroken psychological chain, the identity and survival of the person are guaranteed. But of course, they would not be guaranteed in a scan and copy scenario, and that is the concern. But is it actually true? So let's go through our list. Is there continuous neural function from 5 minutes ago? Sure. Falling asleep, yes. Fainting, yes. Concussions. Seizures, if anything, are the brain doing too much. Strokes, neurological traumas, medical anesthesia. So far, the claim seems valid. The brain really isn't shutting down in any of these procedures. Now, there are two very interesting medical scenarios. They're not exactly the same. One is performed intentionally in an emergency room, and one is basically a form of trauma that you experience. Medically induced hypothermia is an emergency room procedure that isn't actually about the brain specifically. It is performed to save the brain, but it is actually not performed in a brain emergency like a stroke or a seizure. Medically induced hypothermia is an emergency room procedure that is performed on cardiac patients, because when you're not getting good blood flow, one of the first things to start dying is your brain. So while they're trying to save your heart, they want to prevent your brain from suffering sort of loss of oxygen relevant damage. So while they're trying to fix your heart, they will intentionally, in the emergency room, bring your temperature way down to basically preserve the brain long enough to work on the heart and get it going again. There's this other scenario called sometimes called rapid frigid drowning. It's a bit of a misnomer because there are medical cases where this happens not by drowning, but actually by falling into a snowdrift. There are these cases of people who have basically been very rapidly, undergone very rapid hypothermia, either sort of by driving a car into a winter lake or by, like I said, sort of falling into a snowdrift. And these are not cases where people are rapidly saved. They remain drowned for over an hour in some cases. They have been lost in a snowdrift overnight. These people really, it's amazing that there's any prospect of them surviving. What really happens is that they freeze, they drop in temperature so quickly that they are experiencing in nature, by lucky coincidence, the same thing that was being done in the emergency room on purpose. They drop in temperature so fast that the decay of their body and of their brain is actually slowed down long enough that they have a chance of surviving. And these patients end up in the emergency room, and if they are very carefully warmed back up, they can actually recover. They don't freeze solid. There are no cases of a person freezing into a block of ice and recovering. One of the major reasons why that would not be very feasible is that once you're actually cold enough to freeze, the water in your body crystallizes. We all know that ice is actually larger than water, so when you get crystals in your body, it tends to expand and slice apart cells from the inside and cause all sorts of trouble. So actually freezing has not been recovered from yet. The current world record for a rapid frigid drowning surviving patient was about 13 degrees Celsius. So there's actually a caveat to the concern. Yes.
Yeah, quick question. Do we know that any of these patients actually survived? Or is it that they actually died and someone else woke up?
Well, let's put a pin in that. That's a good question. Let's put a pin in that. I'll come back. That will definitely come up later. So first of all, since they're not dropping below freezing, that means cellular metabolism isn't actually ending. So one could say, okay, well, that basal neural activity that we're so worried about, it never really stopped. Their brains were cold, but they weren't so cold that they stopped functioning and the identity was lost. But this is just not true. We know for a fact, because these people are in emergency rooms where we have access to brain scanners, and to say nothing of just sort of EEGs, we know that they are not undergoing any neural activity whatsoever. It's true that, at those temperatures, there's cellular metabolism going on, but the relevant level of abstraction that we model our understanding of the brain on, the firing of action potentials so that the brain can send signals around and process them, is brought to an absolute halt in these cases. It has been experimentally confirmed that below about 21 degrees Celsius, you don't really get action potentials anymore, which is way warmer than these lowest temperature records of people who don't die, regardless of the interpretation we put on it, which we'll get to in a moment. But they are able to at least physiologically survive. And they clearly survived a situation in which their brains did not fire a single action potential amongst 86 billion neurons for an hour. So we just have to decide what our philosophical interpretation is of that. But the medical interpretation is clear. The body and the brain can survive and come back. We know this. It's not a science fiction speculation. These are real world cases. So let's come back to our list. Does the persistence of neural function necessarily exist in all these cases? And the answer is no. It's worth noting that if one is really going to take the stream of consciousness claim seriously, then cryonics isn't real yet. It's not a confirmed process that works yet. But even the notion of it as a thing that people like to think about, people who are against scan and copy mind uploading should certainly reject cryonics on the very same line of reasoning that their argument is based on. That surely, if you're concerned about maintaining a stream of consciousness, then you should reject cryonics. You should believe that when a chronic patient awakens, they are born as a doppelganger, essentially. So in conclusion here, that's not the conclusion of the whole paper, but sort of the summary of this line of reasoning here is that we have real world cases, and this comes back to your point, Randall. We have real world medical cases of people undergoing these medical situations. And the bottom line is, well, your question, Randall, it's an open question what the truth underlying the metaphysics is. But what is not an open question is how we operate as a society. We don't treat these people as some sort of bizarre identity duplicate. Not only do we not treat them that way, sort of, legally, sort of wiping away their legal and financial records and giving them new social security numbers and just sort of all of the all the minutia of running a civilization. We don't do any of that, but we also don't socially, we don't treat medical patients like, oh, you're just some strange philosophical copy. Like, nobody does that. Nobody treats anybody that way. It's just not realistic. And because we don't do that, I'm concluding here on this slide that basically the entire line of argument of the scan and copy aversion on the basis of a stream of consciousness sort of a loss. That line of reasoning, that argument, that belief, it's not just sort of not philosophically thought through. It is inconsistent with our real world day-to-day experiences with medical patients all around us. And I don't think that that's a very good position to frame a personal philosophy from, one that is at direct odds with our day-to-day way of living with other people in the world. I don't think it's a very good argument.
If I can just ask a question that pertains to that, and what I'm going to ask because, I guess I'm being devil's advocate because actually I see things your way, but I'm being a devil's advocate in a little way. So first of all, I would think that you're absolutely right. People would have to treat, say, a cryonics patient or, some fantasy procedure where people are put in some kind of hibernation where their brain completely stops working. And then they fly to Saturn and then they're woken up, I don't know, the stasis pods you see in movies like Aliens or something. All of that would have to be treated exactly the same way as how you would treat the situation of someone who was who underwent this hypothermic procedure. And the two cases are identical. Either they survive or they don't survive. But that said, of course, there is this question: has anyone actually even put a lot of philosophical thought into those cases? Have you, for instance, read any papers where people discuss whether or not someone who went through medically induced hypothermia actually comes back as the same person or not? Has anyone ever written a paper about that? And the same thing for cryonics. Has anyone ever written a paper about it from that point of view?
No, okay, first of all, of course, I can't claim to be aware of everything out there. Someone's going to come out of the woodwork and say, I wrote about this. But here's what I really think is going on is there are many different camps, and they have somewhat overlapping sort of beliefs and values, but I don't think all the arguments and thoughts and lines of reasoning are all being brought together in one place. So you've got people who are strong advocates of cryonics who haven't decided that they're overly concerned with the stream of consciousness. And you've got stream of consciousness folks who think that slicing a brain up aggressively to scan it is going to destroy your identity. But I think those people maybe don't really think about cryonics. Maybe they're not the category of people who are overly sort of enthusiastic about cryonics. And I think that a lot of people either are completely unaware of these fascinating cases of rapid frigid drowning. After all, the number of times people have survived drowning in a freezing lake for an hour could be counted on one hand. It doesn't happen very often. I suspect that a lot of people just either don't know these cases exist or are unaware of the really underlying details. They think that the brain was still doing something, that, you're drowned, but, people drown and get pulled out of the ocean or swimming pool all the time. And they come back because they're only drowned for 30 seconds and the pool was 70 degrees. Like, I just don't think that people are aware of the medical and neural details of these medical cases that say, no, the brain was not doing anything for a long time. And that is philosophically incompatible with this belief that a scan and copy mind uploading procedure doesn't work. Oh, that's the other thing. A whole other camp of people that are sort of, only sort of Venn diagram link, sort of partially overlapping is the whole sort of mind uploading crowd. What percentage of mind uploading people and cryonics people and philosophy of mind people are all sort of meeting in the center of that Venn diagram? I just don't think it comes together in one place very often. And I think that's why you get these sort of inconsistencies of sort of position holding is my best.
Okay, yeah. And just one more thing, because just to be like really precise, another thing that you said while talking about this slide was that you said that it doesn't make sense to base your philosophical argument on something that runs counter to what we socially find completely acceptable. Now, the two things that one could say about that is that there are probably cases in the past where what has been considered totally obvious from a social sort of acceptance point of view turned out to be wrong. So maybe philosophical arguments can go against common understanding or common sort of assumptions. And the other one is that, as you pointed out, these cases where this has happened are extremely rare. So it's entirely possible that we simply haven't caught up with how those cases should be treated, and that perhaps rightly we should have been stripping people of their social security numbers and taking away their house and divorcing them from their wife because they went through a hypothermic procedure.
Excellent point. And no. You made two good points. One, that our philosophy might sort of catch up with and overtake incorrect social assumptions. So, maybe we shouldn't derive our philosophy from how we treat each other. Maybe we should let how we treat each other evolve from our advancing science and perhaps advancing philosophy. I actually will get to some of that as we go along here. The most important point, and this is what I'll sort of get to next, is the unfalsifiability of making any determinations about any of this. So let's see where that goes. So one argument that might be presented, I don't mean to design the entire paper as if it's sort of an sort of unfolding debate, but this is just kind of like, I do this so much with other people that sort of then I design my papers around kind of bringing that verbalization into a sequence of thoughts. So the next step in such a discussion would be what you see on the screen here, where someone might claim that well, current medical science isn't detecting any action potentials, but maybe we just don't understand how the brain works. Maybe there's enough neural activity in some strange sense that we don't understand, that whole argument is still valid. There's some sort of basal neural activity, and it's keeping the psychology alive, and the identity is attached to the psychology. That's an argument you can make. I don't mean to make sort of cruel comparisons to sort of creationism and flat earthism, but that's kind of how this line of reasoning is. This is basically a conclusion that has been decided in advance, and then when all apparent evidence sort of doesn't substantiate it, you start digging around with sort of what if. So it's a difficult way to proceed. But let's just consider this for a moment. Let's see what would actually happen if we just didn't understand what was going on in the brain in these cases. So let's say the true temperature at which the neural function diminishes enough that your identity is destroyed, whatever this relationship is between neural function and metaphysical identity. What if that temperature is 12 degrees, colder than has ever been seen in a real world case? We just haven't seen it. And everyone who has survived so far was actually a preserved original because they didn't get cold enough to lose their identity. What if that was the case? So we're left with this scenario, and this is sort of what you were getting to, Randall. Let's say that in 2021, we read in the papers, that was really, no one reads in the papers anymore. Well, let's say we hear the first story of someone descending to 12 degrees, but now we've determined that 12 degrees was the particular threshold, and this person survives. The whole debate isn't about whether you are physiologically or medically at risk. The person does come back. Their memory is intact. Their own conviction of their own identity seems to be completely unaffected. But we've determined in advance, because sort of prior to this scenario, we made some determination that that your identity dies at 12 degrees. If we then rescued someone from 12 degrees, would we personally, or certainly would we societally, actually treat this person differently because we had made some sort of philosophical determination about them? And before someone leaps to say, well, yeah, that's the whole point. We made the decision, we made the determination that 12 degrees was the cutoff. So the person who came back from 12 degrees is now a copy. Before you leap to say, well, yeah, that's what I would say.
My bad. I made a big mistake there. Before you rush on, I just wanted to check with you. You said your slide says, would we realistically brand her a copy and treat her dismissively? But even if you believe that it's not her, this is still a human being. So you wouldn't necessarily treat her dismissively. You would just take away her driver's license and her ID and everything and say, here, you're getting a new one, right?
So that is dismissive. I think that it would be fairly dismissive to have someone telling you to your face that you're not who you believe you are. That feels pretty dismissive to me. If you have this inner conviction about who you are, and some uppity scan and copy opponent is pointing a finger in your face and telling you you're some other person that runs counter to your entire belief about who you are, that feels pretty dismissive to me. So I don't mean dismissively as in we would necessarily create a dystopia in which we enslave them, but it is definitely philosophically, and I would argue socially, dismissive to just tell people that they aren't who they believe they are because you believe they're someone else. I think that's dismissive. Now, here's the point of evidence, is in the last line on this slide. So we determined that the threshold was 12 degrees, and someone comes back from 12 degrees, and the question is, would we interpret them as a copy? And the response is, well, yeah, that's the scenario we set up. But why not just have that scenario right now? We already have people recovering from neurological states that are currently medically confirmed to break our stream of consciousness. So why don't these, what I call stream of consciousness proponents or scan and copy opponents, why don't they all just say right now, without waiting for this futuristic 12-degree determination? Why don't they say right now that the current world record 13-degree survivor is a doppelganger? Now they might, when cornered in a debate, maybe they would say, well, yeah, I do. But we're not seeing that in our day-to-day world. this isn't, our society hasn't run into any sort of legal issue with this patient. I can't remember her name. Basically, she's just been allowed to continue her life, sort of unbothered by people who don't believe she is who she claims to be or something. So that is a strong point of evidence that if we ever did make such a determination of a threshold, and if we ever did have someone recover from that threshold, that's a pretty good point of evidence that we wouldn't just arbitrarily dismiss their own claim of identity.
I hate to keep doing this, but I just got another question. So
no, that's great.
Let's say that a person who underwent that procedure, or who came back from cryonics, or who went through scan and copy mind uploading, doesn't matter to me which case it is. Let's say that they believe very strongly that they are still themselves. I don't think any of us really debate whether the post-uploading person or the post-medical procedure person would feel that way. And also to the surrounding world, they seem like the same person. And when we talk about, this difference between a third person personal identity, like what does the world think who you are? We often make a distinction there between that and subjective first person personal identity. So what if to the world it doesn't matter? The person you're married to doesn't care really if you're the same person from before, or just such a perfect copy that you're basically the same person in every way that it would matter to the outside world. So who cares if your spirit, if we want to use that term, really got lost and replaced in the process, right? It doesn't matter to the husband, doesn't matter to the government. They don't care. So of course they would treat you as the same person, and the person waking up feels perfectly fine about it too. So we could say, or someone could argue, that simply because there is no argument to be made that the person should be treated any differently, that in any way proves that they survived, that the person made it through the procedure.
Yeah, I'll wrap that up at the end when we get into the value of completely unfalsifiable scientific claims. The bottom line is, you could claim that there are these strange non-physical phenomena at work in the universe, but if they have absolutely no tangible effects, and they are unfalsifiable, and they are unconfirmable, and they are immeasurable, at some point you just got to make a decision about how you're going to live your life. I don't know how else to respond to that, but I'm not throwing it away, because it actually does come up in some of the last few slides. We'll loop back to that. So we're wrapping up this particular set of slides here. I'm just saying, okay, so we decided the 12 degree, we did not decide, we discovered through some futuristic means that 12 degrees is where your identity vanishes. And I'm asking on this slide sort of the obvious question that would come up in a reasonable debate. Well, if that person was one of these proponents, what would they believe about themselves? Nothing about their memories would be any different. That's the whole premise of the thought experiment. They would still feel like they are themselves. The only information they have to indicate to them that they are a copy is that the doctor told them that they got too cold to count. And that's all the information they have to work on. Would anyone really just sort of believe that about themselves? And if any readers, I'm sorry, I actually wrote this in the voice of the paper. If any viewers or listeners, are, skeptics, and I hope my sort of attitude is not too facetious, but if you're one who is concerned about scan and copy on the grounds that you are concerned that your stream of consciousness doesn't sort of preserve through the process, really imagine yourself not just in some futuristic scan and copy mind uploading procedure, because that's sort of, it adds all of these elements of interpretation that are sort of hard to weave our way through. Just imagine yourself in a very real world medical scenario. I mean, any one of us could drive our car into a winter lake. If this happened to you and you woke up in a hospital and they informed you of these circumstances, what would you truly believe about yourself? Really ponder that. And this, okay, so here we go, Randall. What hope do we really have of actually getting any real truth out of any of this? So I previously, for the last few minutes, I was contemplating what would happen if we could find that threshold. Let's say that 12 degrees is cold enough that the brain turns off enough that whatever this a metaphysical effect on your identity occurs and your identity vanishes. But that speculation was actually it wasn't a fair speculation on my point, because there's no way to do it. What experiment can measure your identity? What does it even mean to identify? I'm overusing the term, to determine that your identity has undergone this transformation of a metaphysical nature, that your identity vanishes and a new one somehow is invoked out of the ether. There is no conceivable way to design an experiment to determine this. Now, one immediate response might be, well, maybe in the future we'll know how to do it. But it's not that we need a more advanced science or a more advanced technology. It's that the parameters of this question are what in science is called an unfalsifiable question. There's no machine that you can get in there that will give you a measurement of identity. It doesn't make sense. And if you can't get at it, with physical scientific measurement, then it's an unfalsifiable term. People, the human brain peddles an unfalsifiable belief all the time. Most of history of religion has been sort of mired in confusion on this point. And it's perfectly forgivable that our inclinations are to not be purely and utterly rational all the time. But we have to recognize when we're doing that and try to sort of rein in any sort of any unfalsifiable sort of inclination, because it really sort of leads us away from ways of understanding the physical world around us. I mean, you can have unfalsifiable beliefs, but you can't do anything of any real practical impact with them. You can just hold those beliefs personally. You can't do anything with them in the world. Here's another hypothetical scenario. Once again, let's say we determined that 12 degrees was the temperature that matters. And I have a footnote here just reminding everyone, this is so hypothetical, it can't even be done. But we all know that Netflix and Hollywood are fairly loose in their science fiction interpretations. So someone could write a movie script around this, where in some future there is this identity machine that determines that if you freeze to 12 degrees, if you drop to 12 degrees, your identity is lost. And so you can imagine Hollywood making a really bad movie out of this. People coming into hospitals, and when the doctors take their measurement, they take all their ID cards out of their wallets and throw them in the shredder, and they're appointed a lawyer to help them sort of build a new life, whatever. So here we are. We have two rapid frigid drowning patients. Alice and Bob, they arrive in the ER. And Alice went down to 11 degrees before she revived, and Bob only went down to 13, but they revived physiologically and medically healthy and psychologically healthy. Once they sort of warm up and get over their basic trauma of being too cold, they're able to resume their mental lives. But Alice is treated as a copy, and Bob is treated as an original. And this goes on, the movie jumps forward 50 years, and they've lived their whole lives like this. Not only and Alice was a committed believer in all of this, so she's believed herself to be a copy her entire life. And in this fictional world, everyone sort of buys into all of this. So everybody else treats them this way too. Everyone treats Alice as a copy, and everyone treats Bob as an original. And of course, anyone can see what the next slide is going to do. You all know the script twist here, plot twist here. Decades later, at the end of the movie, they're going back through the medical records, and they figure out that there was a mistake. There were two mistakes. Alice actually only went down to 13 degrees, but Bob went down to 11. 50 years ago, when they fell in the lake. Not only did Alice hold the wrong belief about herself as a copy, Bob held the wrong belief about himself as an original. So not only did they both have the wrong belief about themselves, but everybody else in the entire world has judged them wrong their entire lives. So according to the stream of consciousness theory, they've both been treated and regarded incorrectly, even by themselves. And the point of this thought experiment is that if determining your identity is unverifiable anyway, again, to the footnote, the whole point is you can't even do this. Even if you wanted to take this theory seriously, you can't do anything practical with it because you can't find that 12-degree threshold, that 11-degree threshold, that 6-degree threshold. There's no machine that's ever going to reveal this to us. You couldn't do it even if you wanted to. Also, as I just demonstrated, it has absolutely no practical implications for anything. It doesn't affect how you believe of yourself, except insofar as you can have an erroneous belief because it's all predicated on this unconfirmable threshold. Everyone else can't tell the difference. You can't tell the difference about yourself. And I guess my question is a big old question mark here with an exclamation point. What's the point? This is not a useful philosophy if it has no real meaning. So I'll jump to the conclusion in a minute. One point Randall has made, and at this point I sort of run up against the wall, is someone can say, well, okay, but maybe the metaphysical truth under all of it is still something that we can't get our hands on. Maybe people really are copies, even if they don't know it about themselves, and even if no one else knows it about them, but nevertheless, the original person died anyway. And the only response I have is that once things are in that realm of untouchable unfalsifiability, you just have to let people have their belief. All I can do is lay out a rational argument about the inconsistencies of how certain beliefs bump up against other sort of beliefs, such as our social treatment of medical patients. I can point out, just for clarification, that there are fundamental unfalsifiabilities built into these presumptions. But at that point, that's all I can do. If people want to commit themselves to what are truly basically essentially beliefs that don't have supporting evidence and don't have any, there's nothing you can do other than just say, well, you're welcome to your belief. And I've given you a rationalization one way or another here. So at some point, you just have to throw up your hands and sort of give up. But what I've done here is laying out a line of sort of very careful investigation of the details so we can figure out what makes the most sense. Why does any of this matter? Other than just sort of the fact that people like to argue on Reddit. So here's a big deal. At the beginning, I presented two procedures. Scan and copy, where you take a recently deceased, meaning like literally like in the emergency room within a few hours, you take someone who has died, and potentially you could save their life. I'm a fellow with the Brain Preservation Foundation, run by Kenneth Hayworth, and they are really trying to make the scan and copy procedure. They're trying to make the first half of that procedure, or the first third, not even the scanning part, just the preserving of a brain. Rigorous, real science in the 21st century. We really have a hope of actually taking a bite out of scan and copy and making it an actual feasible technical process. That's how close we are to scan and copy, that we're close to actually doing some of the first steps. Alternatively, the philosophical speculations about gradual in-place replacement with the billions of nanobots infusing through your brain like a foam makes fantastic fun for philosophical whimsy. There's nothing wrong with enjoying it because it's fun. But if you're hoping that gradual in-place replacement is your path to the future, I've got two things to say. One is the parenthetical statements on this slide. Personally, some people just say, literally everything is scientifically and technically possible far enough in the future. I don't know if that's actually necessarily true. Some things it's possible you can't infuse nanobots into a brain without essentially destroying the brain. Maybe you just can't do it. People sometimes imagine the brain, because it's often depicted this way, people often imagine the brain as a sort of loose three-dimensional spider web. There's lots of extra space in there for the nanobots to kind of travel through and find space next to the neurons. That's not what a brain is. A brain is a solid chunk of goop. How are you going to stick 86 billion more things in there? It's not necessarily physically possible to do this. And more to the point, even if gradual in-place replacement can be done, it probably cannot be done until decades, if not centuries, after scan and copy. We will probably be able to actually really do scan and copy mind uploading at some point in the reasonable future, maybe in the next 100 years, gradual in-place replacement will not happen until much later than that. And here's where it comes down to is, first of all, let's just cover this problem here. It's not falsifiable, it's not scientific, and as I say at the top here, it's incompatible with how we treat real medical patients. But most seriously, there is this window of time. See, we exist right now in the first window of time when there's no such thing as any kind of mind uploading. Basically, everybody who dies is doomed to die in this current era. Maybe there's some third time out in the future when all forms of mind uploading are on the table. And if you want to use gradual in-place replacement, have fun with it. But there's a second window of time in the middle there when the more technically feasible methods, such as scan and copy, are available. But the almost impossible notion of gradual in-place replacement is centuries in the future. And if you live in that future, if you live in the 22nd century, you might have to make a real decision about where you stand on scan and copy, because you got to decide whether you're going to undergo it on the belief and expectation that it is you who will awaken and survive, or are you going to have this dismissing belief about it? And I don't mean dismissing like I just mean you dismiss the claim that it will work. If you're going to have that position, then there's a risk people would say, well, I don't want to undergo it then. I don't want to have a scan and copy upload done. So they would basically be lost. They would die. And it's sort of unfortunate, that people might just sort of lose their lives because they basically have the wrong belief. Again, Kenneth Hayworth of the Brain Preservation Foundation has an article. I think the title of it is "Killed by Bad Philosophy," which is exactly this point. People needlessly dying because they will not subscribe to a mind uploading procedure because they hold sort of a bad philosophy that prevents them from allowing themselves to believe in it. And this last slide is for anyone who is sort of interested enough in philosophy of mind to sort of follow along, but thinks that whimsical speculations about the future are sort of getting sort of off the rails. Even if you're not the sort of person who finds mind uploading, to be a particularly serious endeavor, I still think that we should all try to build worldviews and try to build personal philosophies as we navigate through our lives that aren't unfalsifiable. We should be rational and scientific, sort of mental agents in the world, instead of allowing ourselves to be guided by, I use this word a lot, unfalsifiable sort of beliefs. As I said at the very beginning, I beg readers and viewers, especially those who have any sort of instinctive sort of pushback against the presentation, I encourage thoughts. I encourage response. But by all means, please read the paper in its fullness before responding only to the presentation. I also have some other writings which are here. We'll post the slides somewhere, and you can go through this all later. And of course, references aren't overly relevant to slide presentation, but I copied them out of the paper because the whole talk is based on the paper. So that is the end. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Clap, 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 clap. That was really, wow, what a tour of force. That's fantastically done. And just to kind of just quickly jump in and add a little point there at the very end. So you mentioned that people, that the scan and copy procedure would be available earlier, and so people should not set that aside. But even earlier, of course, is brain preservation, right? There's even if the scan and copy procedure itself isn't done yet, not ready yet, and you die before that happens, then you might still be able to have your brain preserved and benefit from that. And that's something you should certainly not toss out, even if you have some doubt, even if you think that, oh, my philosophy maybe doesn't quite support the idea that that's there, that you could still try at least, right? Even if you feel you would prefer to wait for gradual replacement eventually.
Yes, I misstated that. That is again Kenneth Hayworth's point, is that although actually uploading from, completing the scan and copy procedure is a ways out, but we're very close, even in the mid-21st century, to having a viable brain preservation method But, so even people, sort of almost contemporary with this presentation might have the option to just get themselves into a preserved state that can be uploaded later, but they might, there are a lot of people who will write that off. They will say, I don't want to do that because it won't preserve my stream consciousness. You make a very good point. Yeah.
And then a tiny little point just about the technical feasibility of gradual replacement. You're absolutely right, of course, that the spaces within the brain that you see in typical images of neural circuits in the brain, those don't exist because the neurons that you see are just the ones that have been stained, and only a small percentage of the neurons get the staining, and that's why they show up under the microscope and not the other ones. That's why it looks so empty. There's actually stuff filling up all of those spaces. But on the flip side, there are now also technologies such as expansion microscopy that, where you can basically expand the brain, make it bigger, create space so that you can get in there and see more, do more. And you could imagine that there might be a future technology where you would expand your brain while you're still alive and then apply gradual replacement. But imagine that. Now, that's not an easy treatment at all. That would be quite something.
I'm picturing a science fiction scenario in which people are walking around the streets with sort of ballooned heads, and you can tell who's sort of partway through their 10-week uploading process because their heads are all gigantic.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. This was, your slides, by the way, they're really great. I don't know why you were sort of saying that they were just kind of basically mediocre, I don't know, not the thing you were really trying to do or something like that, but I think they look fantastic.
Thank you. I would definitely like to turn it into an actual YouTube video at some point. I think YouTube gets more views than slides, and slides get more views than papers. But thank you.
Excuse me, Keith. We do have some comments.
Keith, I was just.
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
Okay.
No.
We do have some comments from Ken Hayworth in the YouTube chat. I'll read those right now. It seems like Scan and Copy and the like are rejecting the idea of branching identity first, then searching for some physical reason to make it possible. You make a great case that people should question their intuitions regarding branching identity because these intuitions lead to even more unpalatable conclusions. And a question, what popular science fiction treatments of branching identity do you think have the best hope for really changing people's minds regarding this?
Is there a good presentation of branching identity yet? A paper that a TV show that I've been watching, Living with Yourself on Netflix, is about a guy who is he doesn't think he's going to be cloned. He thinks he's going to be I don't mean to give away too much, but he thinks he's going to be sort of improved, and basically he gets cloned. And the show does a reasonable job of showing what it would be like to sort of have these two people who are kind of vying for their claim that they are sort of valid continuations of the original. I'm a little cagey because the show's not. It's still not really committing to branching identity. It gives a little too much primacy to the original and is a little too strong in its assignment of secondary status to the clone. But they are sort of blurring the line to sort of explore the implications. Is there a depiction of a branching identity that just really owns branching identity?
I don't know one of those. I just know one where there's clearly a lot of branching going on, except that it's not examined properly at all. If you remember the old Tom Cruise movie Oblivion, where he, there are gazillions of his clones that keep getting created because, he's working.
I forgot about that.
He's working out there in hostile environment trying to keep fixing things, and he keeps dying, and then there are other clones of him that replace him. But then eventually he realizes he's a clone and he sees one of himself elsewhere. And his wife treats it like there is absolutely nothing weird about this at all. Like, she doesn't care if he's a clone or if he's himself in the end. And so at least the treatment is done in the sense where it doesn't matter which of how many ever branches you are.
but I don't think it was really examined at all. It was, yeah, more about the action, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm shooting in the dark here. I'm not sure if there are any. That's a good question. It would be a good question to sort of see which science fiction depictions have done the best possible job of it. I've been underwhelmed so far.
Oh, Ken made the correction. That SPC is stream of consciousness proponents. So that was my bad in the terminology. Rather than scan and copy.
Oh. Any other questions? Samuel, you had a question, right?
Yeah, Keith. I mean, I was gonna say for myself, definitely this was super enjoyable listening to the presentation. Got my wheels spinning more than they have been in a long time. So thanks for that. But I do have rather sort of on-the-fly scenario, which is sort of extreme testing the unfalsifiability of testing for identity. And I'm wondering whether it's good to ask that, to outline that scenario, whether I'm able to do it now, or better to take it through email. Well, I could go through it if we still have the time for it, Michael. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, of course.
So I'm wondering, whether I'm not in a far distant future, right? Is the reason why it's extreme to extreme test. The scenario implies that the level of skepticism around this needs to be quite high. But I'm trying to get to what would be, say, conditions that we could put in place that can challenge the unfalsifiability claim that you have outlined. And in the very far future, if we can imagine say gradual replacement even working, decades or hundreds of years after scan and copy is possible, say. What if there was an experiment which would take something like to test our technology maturity in a way that we can say that now, if you go through mind uploading, you will be able to preserve your identity after the procedure. And we try to do it in a way where we can understand the brain to the extent of modeling it as well as we can in the first development phase of the brain itself, right? So we are able to say set out the initial conditions that an embryonic brain would look like. And then we, imagine the scenario that we implant that sort of emulated brain into actual biological embryo of a human being, and we just make it sort of live side by side with the biological brain, but with the condition that all the sensory and all the inputs that the biological brain is receiving, also the embryonic brain is receiving. And then the patient or the test subject, suppose, will not be aware of this mechanical brain existing, and then we run the experiment through the developmental period of the person all the way to a young adult, say. And then the experiment would conclude where, at the distant point in the future, we're able to extract the mechanical brain from the location of the physical brain. Say it's co-located to a small enough scale that it's not noticeable by the test subject. We separate that brain and subject the two brains to exactly the same sort of testing conditions. Say, produce an essay on capitalism or something. And if the answers to whatever ways we can test the two brains without introducing any variables that would differ from testing the biological brain versus testing the mechanical brain, the outcome would be exactly the same. So imagine we take the mechanical brain, we implant it into a body. The mechanical brain preserves the memories of the biological brain because it coexisted through the development period, and then it starts writing out an essay on capitalism, and it's word for word the same thing as the biological brain would do in the separate room. Do you think that would bring us closer to saying that we have been able to preserve, like, the concept of identity is not unique to a person? What do you think about the scenario?
No, I won't even touch it. What that would do, well, I mean, it would not for the sorts of opponents of scan and copy who are making this argument. because their argument is not about the neurological and psychological validity of process. This is what you've described is a very good way of empirically validating that an upload procedure has gone well. That the person it produces has done a good job of preserving the psychological traits of the person that you're trying to preserve. But if someone was a committed opponent of identity preservation, their response would be, it doesn't make any difference if people behave the same. For heaven's sakes, they don't even care if people feel the same. In your experiment, all you've done is confirm that to an external observer, they seem to produce the same behavior. But an opponent on the basis of stream of consciousness, they don't even care if the people feel that they are preservation themselves. Even that's not good enough. Because the claim is that there is this, and I try not to sound sarcastic, there is this special metaphysical property, which is not neural function and not even the psychology of your thought. It is this third thing, which should not be confused with the psychology of thought, which is this, that's a mouthful, metaphysical personal identity. And the question of whether the identity of a person carries through the process into the upload. And that topic is unapproachable by any sort of physical experiment. It doesn't matter if they write the same essay. It doesn't matter if their brain waves align, which is what they always show in sci-fi movies. They line up the neural tracings and they say it's the same brainwave. They don't care about any of that. I don't want to say words like magical, but this extra thing, which is your identity, is a major point of concern, because it can apparently vanish into the metaphysical ether. And also somehow, this other point is never made. Somehow there's this wellspring of identity from which you can just kind of invoke a new one, apparently, if you need it. If you don't need it and the person survives in gradual replacement, then I guess you don't need to sort of pluck a new one off of the identity tree. But if you do need a new one, there's just like an infinite supply available to insert into the robot. I don't know. I don't know what to do with this other than get frustrated. But I will guarantee you that if you try to present an argument such as yours, which I think is a perfectly reasonable argument, if you present that to a committed stream of consciousness proponent, that's the term, they will bat it away. It will not survive their firewall.
Well, definitely, at least one outcome is that it's making me more interested into diving deeper into this topic, which I haven't really considered at all. So thanks for the answer. If you can point me in the right direction, by the way, as a follow-up.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, thanks for the questions, and Randall and Michael, thanks for putting it together and arranging it. Yeah, this was great. This went well, I think.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? We have one more from chat.
Yep, do it.
Tom Smith asks, according to integrated information theory, whole brain emulation might require brain-specific neuromorphic hardware to work. What are your thoughts on this? Does it perturb the usual vision in any meaningful way?
So, integrated information theory is the theory most strongly associated with Christoph Koch and Stuart Hamerloff. Help me?
Tononi.
Oh, Tononi. That's Tononi. Hameroff is Penrose. Got it. Right. So I don't think integrated information theory is for or against scan and copy. The main point that integrated information theory would really land on is whether the substrate that you put your upload in is, here, let me just for a second. Jump back to my slides. Are my slides presenting? Or what?
Yes, they are.
Yep.
Yeah. It was this. So if you look at sort of the last two images, you can imagine that by the time you've scanned the model and you've got this computational model of how the brain works, you then have one of two options. You can go to the last image shown here. You can take that model and put it into this physical neuromorphic brain data. What did they call it in Star Trek? Whatever, they had a buzzword for it. A physical computer that basically replicates brain behavior. And you could put that in your robot's head, as I'm showing here in the last image. And integrated information theory says, you're good to go. If you do it that way, you have a conscious mind. If you stop at the fourth image here and you take your model of how the brain works and you run it as this software emulation where all the neurons are basically data in RAM, essentially, then Tanani and Koch, I don't mean to put words in their mouth, but I think that they've basically put themselves out there on this. They would not believe that a brain emulation running as shown in the fourth image here is a conscious person. They would think that it is what is called a philosophical zombie. Everything would seem to work, all the behavior would be there, but the lights would be out, is the common phrase. Now, the important distinction here is that Tanani and Koch, and now I here, are talking about consciousness, not identity. The question of whether something is conscious or a zombie, despite having outward behavior that seems, correct, is not necessarily the same question as whether or not a metaphysical identity has been, sort of obliterated and then replaced with a new one. They're both challenging questions because, in my opinion, I'm not sure if Koch would push back against this, I don't think either one of them is a falsifiable question, which makes it very difficult to really get some scientific bite on them. You basically have to just sort of, to be flippant, you kind of have to choose what you're going to believe. But there are questions about what you're going to choose to believe about two different topics. One is whether something is conscious as opposed to being sort of a non-experiential zombie that just sort of behaves like it's conscious. And two is the question of whether this very abstract concept of personal identity undergoes some sort of vanishment and the new one undergoes some sort of invocation. They're both non-physical questions. I think they're both unfalsifiable questions, but they're not the same question.
Yeah.
That's my response.
Another distinction, I think, is that unfortunately, the personal identity question is one where you find a very large percentage of otherwise very intelligent people on the side where they're happy to defend the unfalsifiable approach, and they're not happy with scan and copy, even if they can't put their finger on why. But it's not true for information theory. So integrated information theory as a theory of consciousness is not nearly that popular. So I would say that among neuroscientists, for example, what Tononi and Koch are suggesting is still considered a somewhat fringy sort of proposal. It's people like the fact that they actually put something on paper and that they're willing to have their ideas debated and tested. But most people who really study the brain and who think about how consciousness emerges and is generated by the circuitry there don't necessarily buy into integrated information theory.
Okay. Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, I think that was all the questions that I think we had. Unless anyone had any more at the last minute, we are going a little over time. So thank you everyone for coming today. So unless anyone had any more questions for the discussion, if you're ready to wrap up the meeting, I think we can do that.
Excellent. Thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Keith. This was fantastic.
Right, thank you all very much. This meeting will be permanent on our YouTube channel. So you're welcome to revisit this again. And with that, that will conclude the June 2020 Carbon Copies Journal Club Foundation Journal Club meeting. So thank you all very much, and have a great day, and we'll hopefully see you in the next one. All right, thank you. And
So,
We done?
live feed is off.
yep, live